So without further ado, we'll move to a presentation by Dr. Nathan Keates. It's only the two of you presenting, isn't it? So it's Nathan Keates, Farradeh Martin, and Chrissia Waldock. But for tonight's workshop, it is Nathan and Farradeh who are presenting their findings on functioning labels. What did we find?
A tempting title for you.
And you got it. Enticed us in.
Okay, yes, well, we are the people talking, so we're going to move past this slide onto the introduction. So just as a form of introduction then, the language used to describe autistic individuals is increasingly queried both within academic and autistic communities. As we well know, that beeping will probably annoy me a little bit, but I'm going to try and ignore it. Yes, so we didn't just ask about function labels. It was a survey. We needed people to tell us how they wanted the survey to be presented anyway, which you'll hear a little bit more about in a moment. So we also looked at person first language versus identity first language, and as well as function labels, high functioning, low functioning being the usual that's used. And these are, as we may well know, categories autistic people have based on their strengths or challenges in areas like language and IQ. And recently there's been a move away from this, and this is what we wanted to find out about these labels to see if there's any better ways to address the diverse needs of autistic individuals. And while some studies have explored language preferences, we wanted to have a deeper understanding of autistic individuals' preferences, and the factors influencing them was still required at the time. And obviously now we've had a little look into this. Onwards. Okay, the other part of this that we were interested in was also autistic community connectedness, and this came about because of the process we went through. Farradeh has probably had quite a lot to say around how he reached this sort of understanding that this could be quite an important factor. So we were interested in this. So autistic people are a diverse group, creating varied perspectives on language and identity. So there's cultural differences and experiences of minority stress that may influence these views. And we could also think about self-stigma from labeling, further impacting language preferences alongside factors such as ethnicity, age, and obviously community connectedness that we're introducing here. And we wanted to examine the link between the language and community connectedness, if words can come out my mouth today, and reveals how identity is shaped by social interactions. And we wanted to, we can also link this to the deaf community being a cultural identification that influences the language use there. So autistic individuals may reclaim identity, and that could well be linked to community centered on shared experiences, or that's generally what we will see there. So community connectedness with cognitive or emotional links to community would be a factor here. And we also know that community connectedness can improve well-being. So this is another factor that we were rather interested in. Moving forwards once more. So to understand what did we really want to find out, here's our aims. This study examines the dialogue surrounding IFL and PIFL, identity first language and person first language. I just like saying iffle piffle, to be honest, suggesting that autistic individuals with greater community connectedness are more likely to prefer identity first language and reject functional labels. That was what we were believing. Thus, we explored ACC, autistic community connectedness, which includes belongingness, social connections, and shared political goals among autistic individuals. And this was developed by both of my colleagues and published in 2022. And we posited a non-directional hypothesis. So perspectives on the PIFL and IFL, as well as function labels, will vary based on degrees of ACC. So we believe that the community connectedness would vary the choice of or preference of person first or identity first language, as well as the preference regarding use or not using function labels. So that's our aim here. Well, that's what we believe would be the case, right? And we investigated the acceptability of functioning labels as well, assessing the pros and cons of acceptable terminology for describing autistic people. And we're not going to talk through all aspects of the paper today. We're just going to talk about some of the key points that we were really interested in. All right. I think I get to be quiet for a bit now.
As someone that worked with Nathan for many months, I can promise he does enjoy the words iffle and piffle. In terms of methods, so there were 516 autistic respondents who completed a survey, and a 19% non-completion rate of the survey. So that's of a total of 637 respondents, resulting in their data being removed. Respondents were only excluded when they were not autistic, so we accepted any other responses. The mean age was 36.13, with a range of people aged 12 to 87. And we had a really great mix of gender identities. So we had 93 were male, so fewer there, but 259 were female, 121 were non-binary, and 21 stated other preferred terms for their identity. The majority of the respondents were white, with 426, which was 83%. If you could slide on for me, Nathan. Thank you. We were all working at the University of Kent at the time. So the research study gained a favourable ethical opinion on the 15th of June 2022 by the Tizard Ethics Committee at the University of Kent. Interviews were initially conducted to gain proposed reasons for functioning labels, and the survey was piloted on 5 autistic individuals prior to the launch, and we asked for feedback on the accessibility of the survey to make sure it worked for as many people as possible. We made several branches in the survey to cater for individual language preferences. So if they preferred IFL, then it would go one direction. If they preferred person first, it would go the other, and various other different forms of that. And the recruitment for the survey began in September 2022 through contacting relevant international, national and local organisations, groups and a social media campaign too. So the survey was fielded between September and December 2022. The survey options were based on a consultancy period interviewing autistic people, and they were asked about their preferences regarding functioning labels and the reasons for or against them. It consisted of 10 core questions, although we did do some follow-ups where it was relevant to. It began with demographic questions, so age, gender, geographic location, ethnicity, race, diagnostic status, and as we said before, only non-autistic people were excluded on this basis. And community connectedness. Yeah, as we've mentioned, what measure we used for that. Is this me as well, Nathan? Brilliant. Okay. The study also assessed the acceptability of various terms. So, for example, person with autism or Asperger's, using a 3-point Likert scale. Subsequently, the survey focused on opinions about functioning labels. So we got a mix of opinions there, utilising a branching approach based on responses. So each response was rated on a 3-point Likert scale. So that was agree, neither agree nor disagree, and disagree. The ACC measurement tool assesses how connected respondents feel to the autistic community. So participants rate their agreement with 9 statements on a 6-point Likert scale, so from strongly disagree to strongly agree. For example, let's say one statement is, I feel a sense of belonging to the autistic community. Scores range from 9 to 54, with higher scores indicating a stronger sense of connection. The measure's validity was confirmed through product moment Pearson correlations, and it demonstrated high reliability with Cronbach alpha. That's all stats that Nathan will be able to explain more than I can. Is this your slide, Nathan?
I'll give you a rest, shall I? Okay.
Yeah.
So analysis. The study was designed to sample a group of people that explored individual preferences, as we've already explained, and the relationship between the language preferences and community connectedness. So quite a lot of what we did was we used descriptive statistics to answer the research question on acceptable language, but we also analysed the data using linear regression regarding community connectedness, and we used some software relevant to that to examine the relationship between the variables and test our hypothesis. So what did we find? That should be next. So here we go. What we found: 80% of the of 503 respondents preferred identity first language for themselves. 15% had no preference, and 6% selected person first language. 74% said that function labels should not be used. Out of the 510 that answered that question, 13% believed that they should be used, and 13 indicated that they did not know. And the survey also found near universal agreement that the term autistic is acceptable, as you can see in table 1. And it is an interesting, some interesting descriptive stats here. So we have about 34% rounding up there that said yes to a person with autism, 22 for Asperger's, 47 for ASD. And the interesting point here is that it was 41 that said no to that. So we have quite a split there. ASC seems to be more acceptable, with 80 rounding up to 49%. And you can see as we go down that what is and isn't necessarily acceptable according to this sample, right? But the important thing, as I've already highlighted, is that we got near universal agreement on autistic, and I'm sure we'll come back to that point later. So in the tables that I will show you on the next few slides, both the difference between identity first language and person first language and the stance for or against function labels were found to be statistically different. Right? There seems to be a relationship between community connectedness and preferences for the language regarding those two areas of words. So those who had no preference also show significance. So as I said before, we also had this point of I don't really know, I don't really mind what the preference is here. They don't have a view or opinion on it. So that also was significant. So there are a couple of models around this, and there's some stats here that we don't need to go into, but just to highlight the fact that 24% of the variance around model 1 should be identity first language is explained by this community connectedness, and for function labels it was 27% of the variance was explained in community connectedness. So that's quite I would say that's good, right? It shows you that there is use of doing this. And the respondents' preferences, age and gender, were found to be significant for model 1, whereas neither age nor ethnicity were significant for model 2. So you see in the next tables, a few tables, that we looked at other factors that might also contribute, and some of them were significant. It's important to note that individuals who preferred person first language had less community connected by -13, and those with no preference had a -7, so they were scoring lower on that autistic community connectedness than those that preferred identity first language, as did those preferred functioning labels, -10 on the scale of community connectedness, and for those that had no preference it was -8. We won't read too much in the tables, but just to show you the tables, at least you can see what is significant with the very small numbers 001 at the side there on the right. And you can see that quite a lot of them were small numbers apart from ethnicity with model 1. So there is something to explore around these factors as well, although some are a little bit more confusing than others in this table. But if we have time, we'll explore it in the discussion. Similarly, with the function labels table here, you can see that a lot of things were significant. Age wasn't really for function labels, and again, neither was ethnicity. But you can see how significant these were with the rather small numbers there. Okay, that is my run through of the results. I'll hand it back over.
Bro, so the study identifies autistic individuals' preferences for language, particularly concerning functioning labels. So respondents favoured identity-first language, with preferences varying by autistic community connectedness. In comparison to CAGE, where the mean ACC was 41.34, fewer respondents preferred IFL, so that's 69.4%, and more reported no preference. The wider data spread in CAGE's study may stem from the higher number of neutral responses. So both studies did not account for co-occurring intellectual disabilities or language use, making it unclear how these factors affect ACC distribution. This study supports the use of language that is most acceptable to autistic individuals. So we highlight the debate on functioning labels and show that community connectedness influences opinions on language use. The findings align with cultural insights from the autistic community and prior research. So there's some examples there if you want to follow up on that. While some respondents found value in functioning labels, many preferred not to use them for themselves, which is an interesting finding. Community membership affected how respondents described the support needs of autistic individuals. So Keating found diverse views on language usage. In this study, 47% of autistic respondents found the term ASD acceptable and 41% did not, while 97% agreed that autistic person is appropriate, further confirming a strong acceptance of identity-first language. So this study aimed to determine whether what is considered acceptable language impacts the attitude towards functioning labels. Specifically, the study aimed to investigate how community connectedness affects the viewpoints on language. It is possible that an individual's level of connection to the community may influence their perspective, or that their viewpoint may make them more likely to seek out like-minded individuals in the community. And thank you.
Great. I'll stop sharing that.
Thank you. That's great. And this is that was the reference for where you've published your research, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Maybe you should put that back up.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you for a really interesting presentation. And I will forever now refer to IFL and PIFL, and I think that is genius. So thank you. So just see if there's any questions come through yet. So remember, you can put those in the Q&A. But again, while people are just formulating their questions, you seem to have had quite a few neutral responses, which, you know, I think has had quite an impact overall. I just wondered what your thoughts were on you know, speculatively, why you think that might be.
Ooh, why might we have neutral responses? Well, I guess we have to speculate that some people just wouldn't have necessarily thought about their preferences. So it's quite possible that it's just a case of coming into contact with the surveying and then being asked questions that they've not necessarily thought about before. That would be the only real thing that comes to my mind. Maybe Farradeh has other thoughts. I don't know.
I mean, I think the way I kind of see all these things is that you know, autistic individuals have as much diversity in their opinions as any other group might have, and a lot of us might feel neutral about stuff that other people feel quite strongly about, and that's just kind of a natural part of a discussion. So I actually think that's quite a valuable insight in kind of normalizing this kind of discussion.
Yeah, and there is that kind of potential for some people that it is just a pragmatic kind of response, isn't it, in terms of as long as we're having positive conversations about autism and autistic people's experiences, you know, at least if we're being spoken about, it is something, isn't it, in a positive way. There is a question that I think I apologize, I missed because I saw diagnosis and then I thought it related to the previous study, but I'm just going to double check in case I'm so that at what stage of diagnosis were people admitted to the study? No, I do think that's yeah, that is a previous one. Okay, just ignore me. Okay, so I'm working on a study right now, and the lead researcher wants to use the term ASD in the survey on the Qualtrics. Do you think in the ethics application it's worth noting ASD could be triggering based on this research and others like it? Great question, Angela.
Yes, well, I think it probably should be noted because there is growing literature base that suggests not to use ASD. You also got to think about who you want to have on the survey, because if there's this high rate of acceptability for autistic and you're deciding to go with ASD, you'll probably get, according to the stats I've given you, you probably get the 41% that says it's acceptable, and the 47% that says it's not acceptable, just won't do it, or they tell you that that's it, that they don't like it. So you also got to think about that, and think about the ethics more broadly. You can think about the impact of having potentially quite a lot of negative feedback on your study, and the impact on the research itself. So I think it's really important to consider. And what we just mentioned earlier is that language isn't static, it changes. We've had previous words in the past around not just autistic people, but if we go with disabled people, there's the words that have historically been acceptable. It changes, it's fluid, and it's the same for this. It's going to change as we grow in our knowledge and understanding in different ways. So I think that's also a point to add in here as well.
Can I comment on that as well, Nathan?
Please.
Before we move on from that one, I think that's a really interesting question, because one of the frustrating things about sort of a more quantitative feedback of this study was one of its unique points was the interviews that kind of preceded the survey, and I conducted those interviews, and I had some really, really lovely chats with some autistic individuals. It was very, very fruitful, and I think one of the main takeaways for me was how researchers using the wrong language is actually a really big problem, and it can be quite triggering for that individual to kind of see that. So I think now that we kind of have a basis to understand what preferences might be, I think it's important that we as researchers follow up with that. I also think, as Nathan says, you may end up sort of precluding certain people from participating, and I think, yeah, one of the, like, to back up on that, I suppose, one thing that one of the people did say was that they participated with our research because we were careful about the language that we used and that we were interested in hearing their opinion. And I think they wouldn't participate in a study that could potentially be doing harm, because to them it's kind of like a dog whistle of, oh, this study doesn't actually listen to the preferences of autistic people, and therefore my research, my contribution to this research could end up harming the autistic community, so I'm not going to partake in it. So that's something that someone said to me. So I think that's an important point to kind of highlight.
Yeah, really, really important point, Farradeh. Thank you. Thanks from Steph for sharing your research link. I can use it in my reasons for terminology in my thesis research. So yes, thank you for that. Do you have any data on the respondents' occupations? I wonder if being in healthcare or research, for example, would influence identity first or person first preferences or opinion on functioning labels, since people may become accustomed to how people in these fields talk about autism. Interesting question.
That is very much an interesting question. I'll just kick off on this question and say that we didn't ask. We didn't ask, but it makes a lot of sense. If you're in a certain occupation, then you're going to use certain terminology. Right, and if we're trying to understand that that there's a need to move away from medical terminology, then if you're in a medical field, that's going to be difficult. So the simple answer is that we didn't actually ask for occupation, but it does make a lot of sense.
something for a follow-up, definitely. I think that would be an interesting kind of study as a follow-up from this one.
Yeah.
Yeah, and another thing to add to the to-do list.
Never ending.
It is, I know. Thank you for coming back to me on the question I started to ask was for you. So thanks for coming back and posting again. So I think Farradeh, you said that people were excluded on the basis of not being autistic. And the question is, at what stage of diagnosis were people admitted to the study? So if they were still undergoing assessment, were they included? Asking because of the length of time it takes to get diagnosis.
First of all, hi Kelly, thanks for coming. That's my supervisor.
Okay.
Nathan, do you want to go? I can't actually remember. I think, as far as I remember, it was that people weren't excluded for self-diagnosis, right? I think it was just if they just said they weren't autistic.
Yeah, so they were only going to, the data would have been ignored if they weren't autistic. So they have to say, I am not autistic, in order for it to happen. If they understand themselves as an autistic person, then they would have completed the survey and we would have used it.
A question from Angela, which I think may be related to your responses about the use of ASD. And Angela says, can I quote you on that? as a postgrad student working with an holistic lead researcher, that would be really nice to have up the sleeve to kind of pull out. An autistic person who is also the parent of an autistic child may refuse to address a question on labelling. I came across this in research that I'm conducting, which again is an extra thing to add in. And I think there's Stephen comments. I think this goes to what you said initially, Nathan. I think many of us don't even realise we have a choice in identity, as the pathological narrative is so compelling. Our identity is given to us by that legacy of deficit understanding. So they not only may they not have thought about it, this may be the first time they're being presented with there are different ways of viewing your autism. Really valid point.
Thank you. I like that response. It's really cool.
Yeah, I like that. Nicola, researching the lived experiences of autistic children in mainstream primary school, and it's been brilliant to see how many of the children proudly say, I am autistic, and embrace their identity. That is very cool, Nicola. Yes, and I'm absolutely delighted to hear.
Can I just recommend something for Nicola? Actually?
Sure, yes, please do.
Nicola, I don't know if you've ever heard of Elle McNichol, but she writes books on the autistic experience. She's autistic and got ADHD herself. She's written A Kind of Spark, and it's also a BBC series. So if you come across any children, I think it's probably suitable for about 8 to 9 years old. And it doesn't diminish the experience of being autistic, but it also paints it in this really positive light of difference rather than deficit. So I think that's a really interesting thing to read or watch for kids, and also adults who perhaps want to see that too.
Yeah, I was actually thinking of that exact thing, because I recently watched the second season.
It's so good.
Yeah.
Oh, I've not watched that yet. I echo your sentiments exactly, as an adult who watched the first series and the first episode, being in floods of tears at the end of this, just wishing this was what all autistic children saw as a representation. So yeah, strongly recommend it. It's called A Kind of Spark. And the book is of the same name, and I know she's written a new book that came out recently, which I've forgotten the name of it, but it's about the Keeley, isn't it? Keates. That's it. A Kind of Spark, that's the one. Yeah, definitely worth a look. Stephen's followed up on his comment that I don't even think diagnosis is relevant in relation to being autistic, as how is it possible to diagnose a way of being? We don't diagnose being a nationality. Good point. And then Claire's, do you present any alternatives to functioning labels, or do you have any thoughts on how else we might describe autistic diversity? Good question.
Yes, so the survey did did look into this a little bit. So we only presented the choices from based on the interviews we did. Here's a selection of what people have already provided to us. Do you think these are good reasons why to or why not to use function labels? So we did look at this, and I'm going to have to give you a cliffhanger ending and say, read the paper. If that's all right, of course.
That is perfectly all right, and we are perfectly on time. So so we've come up to 20 to 6. Victoria, just so you're aware, there are some questions that came through that I couldn't get to during your presentation or in the Q&A afterwards. So I'll make sure I gather all of those questions, and if we have time to answer them, you know, at the end of the webinar, then that would be brilliant. But if not, then I can certainly forward them to you, and we can respond that way. So thank you ever so much for some amazing presentations with some very insightful findings.